although the majority of customers that needed more of a managed service were obviously being redirected to a CS team, we also had sort of differentiation between those customers in terms of the complexity and their needs and what type of even SLAs and opportunities and exposure those customers maybe needed with other internal stakeholders and other teams. So the big thing I think to think about if you are considering it is you need to kind of answer the big questions first and probably walk backwards, which is, why do we think we need to do this? What is the business need? What do we think the benefits are? But also, what's the cost if we don't do this? And how long can we stay as we are, without maybe having that proper process in place? So for us, it was really about, we'd got to a point where the customers we had, the level of service we needed, the complexity of the product, but also the uniqueness of the use cases of the customers we had just needed more of a formal process. We'd also got to a point where, and this is the other thing that I'd also think about when you are looking at whether your team is, mature enough, is we were a customer success team that had dedicated support. We had dedicated professional services. We had dedicated SEs. We kind of had all the moving parts. So we were kind of ready to go, well, how do we make this, something that we monetize? Like, how do we package the benefits of access to these teams and the knowledge that they bring? So we started off with building out, well, what does different look like? What do we think thematically the customers who would fit that bracket versus that bracket would need? How do we make sure that it's justifiable? So is there enough value added at each stage? And one of the things we did initially is we didn't necessarily coerce customers into a particular package. We just sort of said, this is what we think you'll benefit from. These are kind of the options. These are the give and takes. What's the requirement, what's not. And I'm sure as we'll go on to later, this did evolve from that very first stage. But I think what it did was give us the space and flexibility to understand our initial thinking. We also didn't make it compulsory at first. We tested it out with customers that were renewing, or we had very good, working relationships with, or we already knew were really happy with the product and maybe looking to expand. So I guess the main takeaway is you can kind of prepare as much as you can, but when you go live into the market, that's when you're really going to understand how and if this is going to work, and also whether what you're charging makes sense. So yeah, as I said, we'll probably go into this in a bit more detail, but certainly being very clear on there being a real need to do it, how you're going to do it, what that looks like across your customer base as it exists, but also potentially with some view on, what are the future plans of the company and the product, and is that going to shape or evolve that over time? Is it going to work with us, or are we going to find ourselves back at square one and having to redo this again?
Yeah. So it sounds like you spent a lot of time in that determining phase of like, should we, shouldn't we?
Yeah. And even things like, what do we call it? What does that look like? What do we think is going to resonate? And again, there's things we definitely changed over time. But you kind of have to feel confident in your go-to-market approach for it. But also it's not CS in isolation, because you've got to think about sales presenting it. You've got to think about the implications for the teams that you're involving in packaging it up, and how to manage that resource as well. So you can't, underestimate the fact that people might opt into the highest level of service. Do you have the capacity of the people in those teams to actually face it?
Yeah, it's a professional services mindset there, where you have to make sure you have the hours behind you. But I love what you were saying about like bringing it together in a package, and I think maybe that's one way to determine that you do need it, is where you have so many different types of offerings available, like a support package, a education package, a pro services package, and it's like, okay, this is confusing for customers. Like, is there something we could do that would just put everything together for them?
Yeah,
Would you agree?
Yeah, I think you've got to sort of believe in what you're providing. There's value to be had. I've worked in companies before where you maybe don't charge for CS, but you do charge for like those ancillary services. So, data scientists, analysts, reporting.
Yeah.
And that does work. And to be honest, that's probably a very good starting point, especially if the product or the company that you work with does require, getting more value from what you're doing through the expertise of people in the business. And it's quite a good model to start with, where you're kind of testing the waters, like, will people have an appetite to pay if they're getting the value? For us, it kind of just made sense to do the teams we had, because we know that the customer has to go through all those touch points. But we also know that depending on their needs, there's a certain level of requirement and hours and discipline that needs to be supporting that package. So it kind of made sense for us to group it all rather than let people sort of pick and choose. But it certainly meant that we then had to be mindful of them, what we were packaging together.
Right.
Because we didn't want to kind of give them something that they would never use and then still tell them they've got to pay the maximum amount for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Charlie, what would you add on to this idea of like determining whether you should?
Yeah, so in one of my prior companies, we also monetize. And so, we started with similar analysis. I'd say we're probably a little bit quicker in that phase. We were very much of the mindset, move quick, build quick, fail quick, iterate quick. And so, we started with this concept of wanting to boost adoption and use of our products, reduce the requirement and interactions with support, and obviously drive additional growth from the base. All pretty common sense stuff here. And so we packaged up an offering that we felt, was attractive. And frankly, it flew off the shelves. Sold like crazy, went really well. We all started, patting ourselves in the back. Look at us, we're geniuses, right? And, shortly thereafter, call it 6-12 months, we started realizing that there was actually an issue on the finance side of things with the way that we packaged this. And we actually had to remove an element due to kind of rev rec issues. So we had to remove a portion of that. And what quickly became clear was the one portion of that package was actually the value driver. And so, from there, that perceived value on that piece was no longer there. We realized a couple things, but ultimately faced churn issues, for the next couple of years as those contracts came up for renewal. That specific portion of the contract was really tough to defend the value. And so a couple of the takeaways that we got from that, hindsight being 2020, we weren't necessarily mature enough yet to delineate between a basic and a premium. So like I talked about in the first answer, knowing your maturity. Are you too early with, either product issues or the folks that you're selling into, your ECP, ICP, that they expect these things and you're kind of delivering it all? The second being, we probably needed to take a little more time to have some thoughtful, externally focused analysis. If you heard what I said at the beginning of this, adoption of our product, reduce our support tickets, drive growth, all internally focused things, right? We probably should have done a little bit more externally focused drivers, like customer needs driven, differentiated experiences, accelerated value realization for the customers. All those things lead to the same things that I talked about, but you're starting from the right place. And ultimately probably would have allowed us to realize what was the true value for the customer, and we could have packaged it appropriately. And so what we ended up doing was actually repackaging it with finance, began selling it again, doing really well. But it was more of a managed service. That was the true value that our customers needed at that point in time. And then over the next couple of years, we finally actually started to get to that maturity point where we could delineate between basic and premium. And we're now looking again to kind of monetize in that fashion. So a lot of lessons learned in that one.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those lessons. I think that's super important. And like, you mentioned something about maturity and product issues. I'd love you to dig into that and kind of what you learned about like what you do differently if you were considering monetizing with product issues.
Yeah, as I was kind of alluding to earlier in that first question, I think the three big things looking at, whether you should or shouldn't, maturity of your company, the model that you're going to market with, and then potentially even industry. So as you think about the maturity of your company, if you're early, a lot of times you're going to have that ethos, that culture in your company, like everybody does everything. We do everything for our customers. We love our customers, right?
Whatever
And
it's
so it becomes, Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it becomes really tough to delineate between a basic customer and a premium customer,
Mm.
because that basic customer, if they're in trouble, if they need help, you're going to do it. And so all of a sudden you've diluted the offering, right? And so to me, that was a really big point of that. If you're more mature, if you've got an incredible product, it's really easy to sell and keep true value added CS. Same thing on the model side as you think about whether it's like a product-led growth model or a true enterprise-led model. On the PLG side, if you're an earlier stage, or they're in those smaller tiers, it's really tough to sell a monetization package. You're probably only going to do it up at the top ends of your PLG strategy. And the enterprise sales mission, it's almost expected these days, I think, is what we're starting to see. And so kind of understanding where you are, where your company is a big piece of that. And then the last piece just being industry. So, is it expected in your industry? I was in an industry where it wasn't necessarily expected, but it was our differentiator. That's how we were taking market share like crazy. That's how we became the household name, was its differentiated experience with us when no other company would deliver like that. So it became tough for us to actually monetize and delineate between premium and basic, because it was an expectation of our differentiator.
Right. CS was a differentiator, so then monetizing it was like, or breaking it into those two pieces was challenging.
Yeah.
Okay. Great insight so far. Brian, what have you got on this idea of like deciding whether you should or shouldn't, determining?
I think on the surface, to me, the answer is simple. It's voice of customer. You listen to what the customer wants. At Cisco, we have customers of varying sizes. It's amazing to see the difference in spend, logo, or just breadth of industry of our customer base, and also our products. Right, to be fair, for instance, a cybersecurity product will need a lot more hand holding than WebEx installation or deployment. And we noticed that customers, a certain section of our customers were requiring a lot more attention from us, a lot more post sales dollars, and the answer was clear. And also, if you zoom out, right, the ethos, in my opinion, of our industry of software as a subscription is customer pays for what they need, right, and you scale up or down depending on what the need is. And that, I think, spills over or translates into customer success also. We have customers that are bleeding edge and are quite self-sufficient, but then we also have customers that are okay being cutting edge or maybe behind the curve a little bit, but need a little bit more help. And so we decided just a one-size-fits-all white glove service or digital service would not be the right approach. And so through a lot of thinking and iteration, ideating on that, realized that we have to, just like we have freemium models and tiered subscriptions, we had to follow the same kind of model for customer success.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. I mean, Cisco was like an early company to monetize CS, maybe one of the first, right?
Yeah, I mean, don't quote me, but yeah, perhaps I'm guessing, across we grow inorganically through acquisitions. So that's the one common theme. I think when you acquire companies and integrate them, you want to make sure that you provide a very kind of cohesive, consistent level of just customer lifecycle journey, pre-sales to post-sales. And CS is such an important part of that post-sales motion.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about determining. It feels like you have to consider the maturity of your product. You have to consider, like, is this going to add value to customers? Is it something that they are asking for through voice of customer? Let's imagine that you've assessed those things. Yes, this is something that you're going to go ahead with doing. What are some of the benefits that you could expect from successfully monetizing CS?
I think you see more engaged customers because I'll give an example. We have one product where we only help with deployment or quick start, 90 days, really handhold for small customers that do not have dedicated resources to deploy, say, cybersecurity or DNA center, really technical solutions. And we answer all their questions. It's consultative. However, it's also deliverable based. Right? As soon as that is done, and some would argue that's professional services, but it's still post sales. And so once that is done, we're the engagement is complete. Customers extremely happy with that because they know that they're going to use that particular solution, a software or service, in exactly the same way. They're not going to scale it. They're not going to look to upgrade it. So they're happy with that, right? And they're happy to pay for that because they don't want headcount managing that. Should they need additional services and support, that's an add-on, right? And that's the beauty about what I just spoke about earlier, which is you meet the customer where they are and you provide them what they need. They'll pay for what they need. Nothing above and beyond that, especially in today's economic climate where everything is being scrutinized by the CEO and the CFO. And so I think that is one big benefit. We've also noticed, I mean, anecdotally here, I don't have numbers, that customers are happier with a solution that is tailored to them, as opposed to something that's not customized and just here's a bunch of documents that you can go through yourself, right? Maybe 20% of that applies to you, and the 80% does not. So we've seen that tailoring and customizing customer success products to such customers or to any customer has had a much bigger kind of impact in terms of our NPS scores at the end of it. And so those two things, I think, are the biggest benefits, I would say, that we've seen from monetizing certain aspects of the entire CS motion.
And Brian, I'm curious, like, would you say that, because I assume before you monetized, you still had CSMs like customizing, onboarding support, and support thereafter. Like, did the customers attach a different level of value to it after you monetized it?
Yes, and I think it's no different than, again, my experience, than throwing something in for free for a customer. You throw in a product or a feature for free that they don't pay for, and most times, come renewal time, they're like, "Oh no, we don't need it," because the value is not delivered or translated. Right? We don't realize the value from it. No one's had those compelling questions saying, "Hey, this is a use case that you can, or a mission critical priority that you can solve." And so, similarly, if we throw everything at them, which we used to, right? CS was part of cost of goods sold, and it still is in some of our business units. It's still a line item, and the value just wasn't there. We received feedback, like, quite candidly. A lot of those meetings, no one attended, right? Because they just said, "Hey, we are not big enough to be able to, put a resource to this meeting, or we just don't have like our business or our requirements are completely different from what you're trying to show me or guide me to this path." And so those are the two things that I've noticed in my business, in my industry and business segment. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely does. Definitely does. I think it was something we were talking about in the planning for the session as well. And I can see both Charlie and Alex lighting up. So guys, just like go for it. Like, let us know what's on your mind about benefits.
Yeah, I think as you were talking, I was going, yeah. For me, I think if you look at it from two angles, one is obviously the business that you're running, and clearly any decisions you make, as much as the customer needs to be front and center, it also has to make sense for the business. I think we've seen lots of like financial benefits of doing it. Obviously, we are charging for the time, so we're creating, off the bat a revenue center before we even look at expansion, upsell, and obviously there's still a bit of, I guess, separation in the industry between teams that do own that and teams that don't. So it gives you a really good sort of foot in the door for teams that don't own those targets to actually still have, value driven against them, and especially from a CS perspective, not being perceived as just a cost center or just, the ones that make customers happy. Because I think in some companies, thankfully not go Cardless, but in some companies there is still a little bit of a perception of it's just a kind of glamorous customer support. The other thing I'd say is which is actually something we've sort of thought about more recently, is that where you have a bit of a lag between a customer using the product, especially because we work on a like transaction basis, is that actually a like success package or platform fee or however you want to call it is actually something you can recognize the revenue for instantly, even if you can't then recognize the other bit until they actually start, you know, activating or using the product. And of course, you know, we've used it as a tool to allocate headcount, you know, understand our hiring plans. You know, we sort of sometimes even say, well, if a customer needed or was willing to pay X amount, we'd even bring in someone, you know, new, just for, like, have one person on that account. So I think it really does help both, you know, underpinning the value of customer success, but also it's like a really tangible metric for business, and using in terms of hiring, because it's much more black and white than I think we found before. So yeah, there's tons of benefits to a business, and obviously for the customer. I mean, I sort of alluded to it before, but the reason we did it was because we wanted to make sure that customers were paired to the right level of service. And one of the things, which was one of the changes we made, is that we went from sort of going, here's your options, what kind of feels good for you, to be actually almost mandated to a degree, saying, based on your needs and the complexities and your expansion plans and like what you want to get out of this and your roadmap, we recommend this.
Yeah, so it's like, instead of a la carte, here's our set menu.
Yes, yeah. I mean, to be honest, like, you know, we wouldn't even discuss any other options. We would just say, this is what you need. And of course, I mean, you know, people can come in and say, well, you know, we don't think we're going to need that, or why would we need that? And we can obviously give them the context around it. But it definitely was a case, I think, of customers maybe not knowing what they needed. And since we've been doing it more that approach, like, this is what you need, it's just helping everyone in terms of having the right implementation resource, you know, getting activated quicker, having the right kind of success planning with the right kind of customer success manager, being much more tied to what they need. And because we've obviously had the experience of understanding that based on customer size, need, etc., we are able to better match the two than letting people just pick and choose for themselves.
I love that. I love that. So it's an improved experience for the customer, because there's like, they don't have they're like, they don't have to think, and you're also on the hook for their success. Also,
Yeah.
than you would be if they weren't paying for it.
Yeah, I think that's it. It kind of goes back to Brian's point, you know, because they're paying for it, there is, again, more of a perception of needing to drive value from it. And also it kind of requires us to meet those goals. So yes, obviously, hopefully we are, but it also serves as then a focus point to say, actually, we're not hitting, you know, these thresholds or these targets, or, you know, we set certain cadences around meetings and it doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and that's fine, but are we at least getting engagement in, or have we at least tried to establish that success review? One of the things it does is just keep us on point with, are we at least at minimum offering everything that they bought? And then it also serves as a, well, if they're not taking us up on it, is there something going on? Is there something, right? They don't want to meet with us, but they are technically paying for that as part of their package. So it kind of works in all ways, you know, when it's going well, it's going well, and when it's not, you have something tangible to tie back to, because you've almost made this like informal agreement of what you're going to do and what they're going to do, and shook hands on it. And if they're not turning up to these things, it's probably bigger questions to ask.
Yeah, it's that insurance policy. Really great, Charlie.
Yeah, such great points. I don't have too much to add here, just more adding a little bit of a thought on two things that folks said here is, you know, the obvious of bringing yourself as a leader in meetings with other execs and planning, et cetera, from a cost center or rev center. As you think about monetizing and being able to monetize, most likely you've done the analysis to understand what you're delivering for that money. And so to the point there, you've now got a prescriptive set of things that your team's working on, and you're able to elevate yourself out of that potential bad scenario of you're the catch-all for the whole company. Oh,
Yeah.
product isn't working. Great. You're now the product person. Oh, the support isn't what you need. Great. You're now the next level of support.
Yeah.
All of those things tend to happen. I would perceive them probably in the earlier stage companies, but quick call out. Jay Nathan had a great post this week on LinkedIn about it and just hit it out of the park with it. So I'd say that's one. And then the second point is kind of you both touching on, but the double-edged sword of value. So when you tie those dollars to the service your team's providing, you absolutely have customers attributing more value to them generally. But if they aren't receiving that intended value, it becomes an easy line item, something that's easy for them to question, easy for them to churn. And so it goes back to my point on if it's easy to sell and keep, I should say, true value add CS. So as long as you're executing, you've designed it, you're executing what you're delivering and the customer's getting it, it's super easy to be able to monetize, sell it, and keep it. But when that equation starts to break down, whether it's their side or our side, you start opening yourself up.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's tap into that a bit more. So let's talk about hurdles that people can expect. Like I think we've all aligned on the benefits here, but what hurdles do you think people should be aware of? I know Charlie, you already talked about a couple of things you would have done differently with slowing down on launching the different tiers, but what other hurdles do you think people should be mindful of when monetizing CS?
Yeah, so I think I talked a little bit about it, but being able to clearly delineate between basic and premium, ultimately being able to execute on that, delivering that differentiated experience. If you don't deliver on that, you're ultimately going to dilute it and you're going to basically send it towards churn. And so I think that's at times, like I said, tougher for these smaller companies to deliver, premium offerings to customers. And I think that's something that folks just ultimately have to be able to ensure that they can do and they're mature enough to do. And then the other piece that I would say here is ensuring that there's, strong self-serve and or scaled resources for your customer set so that they don't feel like it's, hey, I've got to pay or I'm getting nothing. You've got to have those foundational elements there so that they know they can operate, they can be confident in your software and the services you're offering. And then if they need that next level, it's there and it's a positive for them versus hey, it's all or nothing and we're just doing this to make money.
Yeah, like you don't want to only give them a monetize a charged package where they feel like they're being like held with a knife against a wall, right? You want to have a free offering, and those scaled resources can make a huge difference there. Right. I think the other thing is, like, in a busy world, simple always wins. And oftentimes in CS, we say, oh, sales didn't sell this properly, but like, what are we doing to make it easy for us to convey this package, right? Are we making it simple enough for customers to understand,
Right.
in one sentence or a paragraph, or, Alex is nodding her head on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of our first learnings was we sort of probably did kind of what Charlie said he'd done previously, which was like, how do we think we should call this, and how do we think we should sell this versus how are these things generally sold? What would the perception be from the customer? You kind of come up with these, like, I mean, really unoriginal, but you think you're kind of almost marketing-y names of like this, that, then that, and everyone goes, oh yeah, I know, I'm going to move my way through because that, or I don't want basic, I want the best of the best.
Right.
But
yeah,
what we realized was that it kind of didn't mean anything to anyone else, and also it made it really hard for sales because it just it left it too open to interpretation. We also found that, and actually this is kind of the point we we're talking about before around tangibility, like I think this is going to be the hardest one for anyone who implements this, is like there's things that operationally you can commit to. So it might be SLAs and support times and dedicated EBRs and access to execs or cabs or any of those things, but so much of what CS does is kind of hard to describe and is sort of intangible. And it's was one of the hardest things we found at first. Now, I think now our customers are all pretty much in cycle and they have their packages and they see directly, you know, what that looks like in form of a person. It's become quite easy to continue to renew it. And our you know, retention rates on our packages is super high. But getting it off the ground was hard. And sales kept asking us, well, you know, what does this mean? Like, what? And you want to say, oh, but it means you've got a really great CSM who is, you know, really strategic and is going to do these things. And it's, what does that equate to? So definitely being really clear with how you're going to market, but also how you prepare your sales team to sell it, is a big one. And I think also listening to their feedback. So they were the ones that actually said, we don't think this positioning and naming convention is working. And it did take a few sales reps going a little bit rogue and doing their own thing, to test and learn what actually did work, which normally you'd be a little bit angry about, but it was working. And so we kind of made the executive call to go with what the market was responding to versus what we had originally intended. So yeah, it's definitely the positioning and working with sales, but also, you know what, giving them a little bit of license to probably test it and learn and get that feedback and get their buy-in.
That's great feedback, Alex. And I guess, like, I'm curious, for Go Cardless, do you have one slide that can be used to explain the monetized packages, or is it more than that?
Yeah, it depends.
Yeah.
So we do have kind of one slide that would sort of give you the overview, because we are now also directing them straight to, this is what we think you need.
Yeah.
Earlier on in the sales funnel, so, you know, there's probably more slides because we're kind of still scoping and we're still sort of figuring out.
Yeah.
And so what it allows us to do, though, is to ask good questions around, is this going to be something that you think you might need? What are your plans for working with us globally? How many accounts do you think you're going to need? Or, you know, so you kind of can use it to actually help with the discovery as well. But we typically then wouldn't present the option until we really understand the needs, because then it does help kind of build that trust, like, we've heard you and this is what we think is going to be best for you to get value quicker, and at more scale.